Thanks for being here today for these questions, Tom. I was wondering, first of all, could you clarify for a general audience the difference between Dean Radin's double slit experiment and the variations on the double slit experiment, the classic one that you have written and you are now conducting?
Sure. The experiment that Dean Radin did with the double slit and the experiments I'm doing with the double slit, they sound like there may be similar things. Oh, you're both doing double slit experiments, but they're absolutely two completely different kinds of experiments, experimenting with different things. Now, the experiment that Dean Radin is doing is not a quantum experiment. It's not a quantum physics experiment. To do that, you have to put particles through the slits one at a time. That turns it into a quantum experiment. He's shining a laser, which is a stream of photons, billions of photons streaming through these double slits. That is called an optics experiment. So long before science ever heard or ever thought of quantum physics, it was doing optics. It was doing optics back in the 1800s. Optics was a science then. So it's an old science. And even back in the 17 and 1800s, they realized that if you shine what they call coherent light, now we can make coherent light with laser pointers. They only cost $15 at your local electronics shop, so they're inexpensive. But then there were no lasers. So they had to take a source of light and put it far, far away so that the wavefront was pretty much planar by the time it got to the double slits. That's how they got coherent light back in the 1800s. But they knew that if they shone coherent light on a set of slits with a barrier, a big barrier with two slits in it, that they would get an interference pattern on a screen behind it. It's just an optics thing. Okay, now you can call that a double slit experiment. But that's not at all like the double slit experiment that they talk about in quantum physics. That's entirely different. It's a very different thing. That's a quantum experiment, and it's done by putting one photon at a time into the double slits. Okay, so you can correlate with exactly which photon went through that slit and where did it go on the screen. You see, that's a correlation you can make. And that's now an experiment down at the quantum level, and that's a quantum physics experiment. That's what I'm doing. What I'm doing is a physics experiment that will eventually produce a paper that will be put in a physics journal. What Dean Radin is doing is an experiment in the effects of consciousness, and it will be published in some consciousness journal. He's not doing a physics experiment. And the experiment that he's doing has been done, I don't know, in 100 different ways. And they're all interesting, but they're all basically the same experiment. And that experiment is the one that determines that you can affect future probability with your intent. Okay, now, one of the simplest of those experiments is just a random number generator. You have a random number generator, and not one created in a computer, but one that is what's called a natural generator or an event-based generator, which is generally the randomness is created by radiation of a particle. And that random number generator will generate random numbers, real random numbers, not pseudo random numbers, but real random numbers. And if you take somebody with a little practice, they can use their intent to modify the average value of those random numbers. Okay. So if the random numbers are between the 0 and 10, then you'll get 5. That'll be the median. If randomly you get something in that group, all with equal probability. So it's that sort of thing. But if you can bias it a little bit so that these random numbers don't always end up at 5 or 0.5, let's say it's between 0 and 1, then you get an average number of 0.5. If you average a whole bunch of random numbers from this generator that goes from, say, 0 to 1, then you get a 0.5. So you can use your intent to get, instead of a 0.5, to get a 0.49 or a 0.512. Well, the way that works is that there is a fair amount of randomness in that. In other words, if you run 1,000 random numbers between 0 and 1, you're not likely to get 5.00000. That's almost impossible. You're going to get 4.9993 or 4.92 or 5.001. There's any selection of 1,000 of those random numbers is going to give you something a little different. Okay, they're not precisely going to come out to 0.50000. So there's a little bit of noise in there, a little bit of randomness in those random numbers because you're taking a particular set of random numbers. All right, now if you did it with 100,000 rather than 1,000, then that little fluctuation would be smaller. And if you did it with 1,000,000 random numbers, then that would even get closer. So if you do it with just, let's say, 5 random numbers, you might get 0.48, 0.4, 5.5, 6. With only 4 random numbers, you could be off, right? Because the random numbers don't have to average to 0.5 when you have such a small number of them. So the more you do, the less fluctuation you will get. Okay, now that's just a little number theory, so that's how it works. So they take a random number generator and use their intent to modify that average value of the random numbers. And people can do that. And that was one of the things that Pear Labs did. That's one of the first things they did. And they did that experiment 1,000 different ways. They had little robots that were random, how they would move. And you could use your intent to make them walk off the table when they should have just dithered around, randomly in the middle. And they just did that experiment over and over and over again in all sorts of ways. And people have since made up different kinds of ways that Pear Labs never thought of. And this one that Dean Radin's doing is one of those. They use people focusing their intents to modify future probability. And within the uncertainty in the situation, they can modify that uncertainty to be more to this side or to that side.
So what does it mean that the people who were doing the intention experiment to modify future probability collapsed the wave?
Well, that is very confusing. What he's doing has nothing to do with collapsing a wave function. Now, he says that in his paper. I have his paper right here, and it starts out abstract. The double slit optical system was used to test the possible role of consciousness in the collapse of the quantum wave function. Well, as I said, this has nothing to do with quantum anything, and it has nothing to do with the observer phenomena in quantum physics. That's a different thing.
Okay, that was my question.
Yeah, that the wave function collapses is really just a metaphor. There is no wave function that collapses. It's just a term, a metaphor that physicists made up to try to explain quantum physics. There actually is no wave function. It's a probability function. There is no wave. Waves don't collapse. So, again, think of that as a metaphor. It's not actually something that happens, but it's a metaphor that physicists used to describe what happens in their theory, which is a probabilistic theory of matter, basically, that matter doesn't exist as little pieces of mass, it exists as probability. So that probability function is what they call the wave function. So that probability will collapse to a physical particle just means that when you measure something, you get a physical result. That's what a measurement does. It gets a physical result. But what that result is can fluctuate with uncertainty. And what Dean Radin is doing is using intent to modify that uncertainty. It's not actually saying anything about the mind collapsing the wave function.
Okay, I think some of the words he used were that consciousness responded to the particles and the entangled pairs. I think that was one of the phrases, I believe.
Yeah. Well, in a way that is true, in the sense that you would say that, Well, let me give us a little different example of that. Another, and then I'll come back to that point.
Okay.
Another way of using your intent to modify future probability is with mental healing. When somebody uses their mind to heal another person, they're modifying future probability, because the body has so much uncertainty. All sorts of strange things happen in the body because we don't really understand it very well. So there's lots of uncertainty going on there. You know, people with stage 4 cancer and only, 3 hours to live, get over it and come back and don't have any cancer at all. Well, why does that happen? Well, we just don't know why that happens. There's lots of uncertainty when it comes to the biological system, because the biological system is so complex and we understand it so little. So we can modify future probability within that uncertainty. So that enables someone to heal with their minds. That's just another exercise of the same thing. So if you did experiments in healing, get a bunch of healers and see if they could, fix things and people had wrong with them. You could do those experiments, and you'd be doing experiments in intent modifying future probability. You do random number generators. It's an experiment in intent modifying future probability. You do what Dean Radin did with his optical double slit, not quantum double slit. And it's the same thing. You're measuring that people can modify future probability with their intent whenever there's enough uncertainty that they can do that. So now, how is it that they can do that? Well, in these experiments, even in the optical experiments, there's lots of uncertainty in them because they are so precise. What you're doing when you change that interference pattern is you're changing things by small fractions of a wavelength. Well, the wavelength of that laser light is 6, 10 to the minus 8, something like that, meters. I don't know if I have that number right, but let's just say it's very, very, very small. And if you actually move that distance that light's traveling, see, the wave travels like this as it goes. That's its waves, its wavelength. There's a little piece of distance, if you want, a wavelength, or a little piece of time, which is the time between wavelengths. That's its frequency. So waves have frequency and they have wavelength. So if you change it by just a fraction of a wavelength, you'll change the result, which means it's very, very tiny changes can do that. Well, what are the uncertainties? Well, the uncertainties are all sorts of things: vibration, expansion and contraction, heat, thermal effects, motions, that things move, just all sorts of little tiny things can make differences. So within all that uncertainty, all the gathered uncertainty for all the different ways that things might affect that experiment a little bit, consciousness can modify those effects and make them all pile up, just like to make the average value of the 0 to 1 come out to 0.502, even when it should have come out to 0.5001. So they can make it bigger than what the uncertainty is. They can make it come out above, say, greater than 0.5 every time. Whereas if it was random, it'd come out greater than 0.5 half the time and a little less than 0.5 the other half of the time. But they can make it come out a little greater than 0.5 all of the time. You see, that's because they can use their intent to do that. So this is what Dean Radin is doing. It's the same experiment that's been done. It's the same thing that we work with healers. It's the same way that people use their intent to get parking spaces for themselves. Dennis, you could listen to Dennis tell a story about his doing that. There's just lots of things that people do. The people who have a positive intent that the sun will shine next Saturday, and those that have an intent that it'll rain. We have all these intentions out there, and they modify future probability. Now, once you understand the nature of reality and realize this reality is a virtual reality, it's computed, and the thing that allows it to be computed is that what happens next, in other words, the future, what happens next, is decided by a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. That's how the system knows what to render next. Okay. Now, that future probability is the probability we're talking about. You can change that probability some within the bounds of the natural uncertainty. Okay. And depends on, several factors that depend on it. And some people are better than others at it. But yes, when your friend Richard changes somebody's hip alignment, okay, that's what he's doing. He's using his intent to modify future probability. And in the future, the hip will be aligned. In the past, it wasn't. So see, all those things, like I say, there's thousands of different ways that you can apply that thing. So that is what Dean Radin is doing. He is doing another experiment that shows that intent can modify future probability.
I think
Well,
that's good, some good evidence that
yeah.
consciousness is at the root of reality. How is, I know your quantum experiments, your quantum physics experiments are also going to show that consciousness is at the root of reality in the way that the original double slit experiment did. You've written several variations of
Yeah.
it, but how does this compare with this kind of evidence from intent? How does this speak to consciousness at the root of reality the way Dean Radin has done this?
Yeah. Well, what Dean has shown is that there's a connection between what we think, our consciousness, and what happens in the world, that there's a connection there. Okay, that's the mind matter connection. So he's doing experiments that basically say there is a mind matter connection. Our intent does modify, what happens here. Yay, that's good. So that's basically what the experiment does. It says that mind affects what happens. All right. Like I say, we've done that 1,000 different ways. And it's good because people are very thick-headed on that because it runs counter to materialism. Materialism says the material world just is the way it is, and mind has absolutely nothing to do with it. Mind can't affect reality. Reality's there because of physics, and whatever a mind thinks is irrelevant, you see. So what Dean and the hundreds of others and Pear Labs have all done by demonstrating over and over and over again that mind can modify future probability, or in other words, that, mind can affect matter. They're just saying that reality is not materialistic, that consciousness is a strong player here. Okay, they don't necessarily say what, they just say consciousness is part of what makes us and what we find in our reality the way it is. Consciousness is an effective player. And that's basically all they're saying. Now, the fact is that consciousness is fundamental and everything else isn't, that the physical world's not physical at all, it's computed. We live in a virtual reality, but they're not really proving or even giving evidence for any of that. They're basically just producing evidence that there is a mind-matter connection. So what Dean is doing is one more experiment out of basically thousands. I think Pear Labs probably gets the 5 gold stars for doing this more and better and more consistently than anybody. And Dean's done a lot of it too. He's done a whole lot of these experiments that basically show there is a mind-matter connection. Yahoo! Now that's good because it shows materialism is wrong. So, take off your hat, bow your head a little. That's a good thing to do. Yay, Dean. That does not have anything to do with quantum physics. It doesn't have anything to do with this metaphor of mind collapses the wave function. That's not really involved here. That's a quantum idea. Now, what my experiments are physics experiments. These are not how can intention modify the world. My experiments are just straight out physics experiments, actually doing the quantum version, not the optic version, but the quantum version of the double slit. And then my first experiment is to determine something about this collapse of the wave function metaphor. It's not collapsing, but how it is that we get a physical particle. And why is it that if you look at which slit it goes through, you get one result, and if you don't look, you get a different result. Why is that? Well, from my worldview, which is this is a virtual reality and consciousness is fundamental. The reason you have this, what's called the observer paradox, is because it is a virtual reality and it exists only in the minds of the players. If the information doesn't get to the mind of a player, it can't get into the virtual reality because the virtual reality is only in the minds of the players. Now, I said that very easily, but it takes a lot of thinking to come to the point that that makes sense to people. But my model kind of supports and verifies what was called the Copenhagen interpretation. Well, it wasn't the interpretation then, it was the result of the Copenhagen conference, where they said, here's what our experiments have shown. And basically they didn't say why. They didn't know how it worked. They just know that this is how it worked. And my theory agrees with them. That is exactly how it has to work. And since then, science has gotten away from that idea. They've used the concept of entanglement to try to slip back into the realm of materialism. And materialism with kind of a variable flapping loose that nobody understands. But anyway, that we digress. So that's the difference. Mine's actually a physics experiment that's going to tell us something new about the observer paradox. Or actually, it's going to tell us something old. It's going to, I think, kind of reassert the Copenhagen results. And that's just the first of my experiments. That's the simplest one. After that, they get a little more complex. But all in all, what mine will do that Dean's doesn't do is that mine, because it's an actual physics experiment, is going to provide physical evidence, real scientific evidence, not just that mind can affect matter. Now, Dean is providing evidence that mind can affect matter, but mine's going to have evidence about the way the world works, about the nature of reality, not just that mind can affect matter. It's going to give evidence not only to determine how that observer effect works, and what does it mean to say that the wave function collapses? It will explain what that means. It'll explain that metaphor. The metaphor is not literally true, but it will explain exactly why we get what we get. Okay, so that's physics. That's a better understanding of physics, which is where mine goes. Dean's is a better understanding that mind affects matter. It's one more experiment out of that group of thousands that says the same thing. So it's just another piece, another time that it's been done in a different way that adds credibility to that claim.
I think it's valuable.
My experiment is going to produce evidence that consciousness is the computer and that this is a virtual reality, because there will be no other way to really explain, rational way to explain the results that I'm doing. I'm going to do a few miracles, just like the double slit itself, is a miracle, right? That things happen the way they happen. They happen outside of materialistic understanding of physics. So I have a few things I think that will also happen outside of a materialistic view of physics. Yeah. So that's it. So it's
we
different.
have several physicists working on that in several different universities. So that will be very interesting.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could clear up just for me the statement that now mind affects matter is a great experiment that just adds to the credibility that consciousness is fundamental. It doesn't state that as yours will, but it adds that consciousness affects things in this physical reality. So when he said it responds, when Dean Radin said the consciousness responds to the particle and the entangled pairs, what exactly is meant by that?
That's more metaphorical. Is it the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail? It depends on which end you're at. If you're a flea on the end of the dog's tail, you see the dog going back and forth. You think yourself as stationary. You know, you're in an elevator going down and it looks to you like the building is going up because you think of yourself as stationary. So that's just the relativity of viewpoint. So yes, there is an interaction going on there, but are you going to say that the mind is what affecting the particle, or the particle is affecting the mind? You know, there's an interaction going on between mind and particle. You can say that A is affecting B or B is affecting A, and it doesn't really matter. There obviously is an interaction going on between B and A, you know, A being physical reality, B being mind. And whether it's A is manipulating B or B manipulating A, you know, it isn't something that they prove or disprove. All he shows is that it happens. There is an interaction. So that's why he doesn't end up with really any physics or new science out of it. He just ends up with another way of showing that there is a mind-matter connection. Not anything about that. It doesn't show up anything about that connection, really. It just says there is such a connection. Until they get to the point of being able to understand the nature of reality, then all they're going to be able to do is speculate about that connection.
It's a cool experiment, though, and I think it's relevant to what Richard does. Just simply that mind affects matter in the as a future probability, as you say.
Well, that's, you know, what he does, I guess, would be on the side of healing, right? If you make a hip that was out of place,
spontaneous postural alignment.
Yeah, so that's a healing thing, and it all falls in the same category. You know, it's not a hard thing to demonstrate. Like I say, it's been demonstrated over and over, but people like Dean Radin and Richard and Pear Labs, they do this demonstration under very precise conditions. They do it, you know, not like, you know, I did it once all by myself. Believe me, it really works. You know, they're doing it with very careful protocols.
Yes.
Trying to eliminate all the other variables. You know, they're doing it in a scientific way so that it's impossible to say that it's not a consciousness matter interaction. It clearly is that. You know, it's not like you can't say, well, there, you know, he had a card up his sleeve, you know, there was a trick involved. They do it in such a way that there are no tricks involved, which means that people should come to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, mind does affect matter. The other way around, does matter affect mind? You see, nobody's shown that. They're only showing that mind affects matter. So when he says that the particles interact with the mind, well, yeah, they interact with each other, sure. Respond to sort of sounds like the mind's responding to the particle. I'd say it's more likely the particle's responding to the mind. But really, there are no particles. You see, there aren't any particles. There's only probability. There's only the potential for a particle. It's not until the measurement's made that we actually get particles. So he's measuring a result. He's measuring a result, the kind of pattern, the kind of interference pattern you get when it goes through two slits versus the kind of pattern you get when it goes through one slit. And he's having his people try to get the particles to all go through one slit instead of the other. Well, a particle comes out of a laser in any number of directions. There's a little lens there, and it comes out kind of in a straight line. But now photons are very tiny little things. And whether it goes through this slit or that slit is random. In other words, there's just as many go through slit A as go through slit B. But exactly which particle goes through what slit, nobody knows. It's just a random process because the laser beam actually covers up both slits. So anything in that beam could come, you know, so whatever goes through a slit, nobody knows where that photon came from exactly. It's somewhere in the gas inside the laser. You know, the laser gas gets pumped up, then it gets stimulated, it all crashes, all the light comes out at once. It's all coherent. That's what's called a laser. And then some of the photons go through this slit, some go through the other. Well, that randomness can be modified. Of course, you can modify that random with your intent, within the bounds that's natural to the randomness in the laser that they're using and in the equipment that they're using, because it's not just the laser, but it's the slits and how wide the slits are, and the mechanism that then goes to the screen, and getting all of that aligned just perfectly will make a big difference. If you bump one of those components that's in his optical path, well, the whole thing will change. You know, if you vibrate it even 1/100th of the width of a hair, everything changes, because the 100th of a width of a hair is still huge compared to the wavelength of light. You see, so there's lots of little possibilities for a little bit of change here and there. And you can use your intent to build them all up to one side or the other. Like you can make it always a little greater than 0.5 or always a little less than 0.5. So that's it. You get all the various random things rather than all the random things. Because they're all random, nothing really changes much. You just dither around a little bit. But if you get that random to bias itself one way or another, well, then your results bias themselves one way or another. And that's the way it works when you heal. When Richard gets a hip to line up, basically he modifies future probability with his intent. Okay, he has an intent that things will change. Well, what makes that hip stay that way? Well, there's all kinds of things that make that hip stay that way. Tension in this muscle, tension in that muscle. You could probably list, you know, at least 100 different things that make that hip like that. Well, maybe one foot is slightly longer than one leg, slightly longer than another by 1/8 of an inch. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe an injury here, maybe an injury there, maybe tight muscles on one side because of the job the person does. It always works with one side more than, you know, there's just lots and lots of possibilities. Again, the body is a very complex thing. So why is that hip like that? Well, there's all sorts of reasons that add up to that hip being that way. And each one of them has some uncertainty around it, that it is that way, or it could change and not be that way. A muscle can just relax. That's a possibility, or it might not relax. But there's some randomness in whether it relaxes a little or doesn't relax a little. He just takes all that uncertainty and gets it biased to the side of making that hip straighten out. And
Well, you know,
bingo,
Tom, what's
there it is.
interesting, yeah, all these experiments are interesting, but you know, what's particularly interesting is that Richard can teach this to anyone. His, like your philosophy, like your theory, is that you can do this if,
Yeah,
you know, it has to be your experience. This is something that you can do as consciousness.
yeah,
So that's the valuable,
yeah,
interesting
everybody
thing that
can do
he's
it.
doing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all of us, we are not our bodies, we are consciousness.
yeah.
And as consciousness, we have many capabilities that we don't even know that we have. There's lots of information and lots of things we can connect to. And, you know, they talk about it as powers, but, you know, that's
Hmm.
kind of not a very productive way of thinking of it. But there's lots of things that consciousness can do if you just understand consciousness and how it works. So sure, you can teach people. You can teach anybody. I mean, you talk about, you know, a bunch of 11-year-olds. Well, what about the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds that Evelyn has taught children in Germany to
Yes,
be able to see blindfolded?
yes.
She calls it
Another great
seeing it without
experiment.
eyes.
Yeah.
Okay, now that is a little different. That is not modifying future probability with the intent. That's basically getting data out of the database
Yeah.
with an intent, which is another thing consciousness can do. Consciousness can modify future probability. Consciousness can get data out of the databases. Consciousness can do multitude of things. Those are just two of them. So she takes a different one and she has them get data out of a database that tells them what's in front of them. So they can read, they can play the little air hockey game they were playing, hit the
Okay.
puck and the puck flies real fast and it takes real fast reflexes and
Yeah.
coordination to do that. Well, they were doing that blindfolded.
Yeah.
Well, how does that work? Well, it works because you can train a consciousness to get data out of the database. It's as simple. It's a real-time remote viewing is what it is. So basically, if you want to do these things, all you have to do is come to the conclusion that it's possible. And that is the big step. So if he takes people and he trains them and they understand that it's possible. And then they have to understand a little bit, they have to practice a little to develop their skill at getting the data or changing the future probability, whatever. They have to practice at it to do it. But once you do that, then the results are confirming, and then it gets easier and easier. And eventually, over some time, you can get pretty good at it to where it's extremely reliable and
Well,
extremely accurate.
I think you're the only physicist who teaches these things that you were mentioning, teaching, getting data out of the database, exploring the larger consciousness system, so exploring the larger reality,
Connecting with other
healing,
people, telepathic communications.
remote
I mean,
viewing.
yeah, all these things are
You're the only
available to
person,
anybody.
you're the only person who actually teaches that to people. Now, you have a new product out called Tom's Park, which you were very excited about because that is a breakthrough tool for the left brain people who rely a lot on their intellect, who perhaps have never used a lot of intuition. Explain a little bit how that would help people uh, get into all of these things that you say we can
Well,
do as consciousness.
all right. Basically, all of the so-called paranormal things all happen on the intuitive side. Your consciousness has two different paths for processing information. One of them is what I call the intellectual side, the intellectual half. The other is the intuitive side. Okay, the intellectual half basically uses logic. It gets a lot of information and tries to project, what that information says. It uses logic. The intuitive half doesn't use logic. The intuitive half just gathers information, just gets the information, and it knows. It's knowing without logic, without rationality. It's just a knowing, intuitive knowing. Okay, now that's consciousness collecting data out of the databases and otherwise understanding things from a very big picture view, as opposed to the intellect tends to understand things from a little picture view. It gathers information out of the little picture and gathers and gathers and gathers, and then it tries to come to conclusions based on that. So it's kind of a bottom up, and the intuitive side, kind of a top down. You just have this big picture of how things are happening or what's going on, and you won't necessarily get the details, but you'll get the most meaningful part. Whereas the logic on the intellectual side works with the details. They get all the details and they take all those details, and from that, they develop a story. So they're two just different ways of processing information. Now, this is consciousness. Consciousness has an intuitive side and an intellectual side. So Tom's Park was to help people who are kind of stuck in their intellect. So they can't really let go of that need to build everything up from details from the bottom up. So they just have a hard time seeing big pictures, because as soon as they see a big picture, they want to build it up from the ground, and they can't. They don't have enough information to do that. So then they kind of throw that picture away because they can't justify it, you see, and they just have a hard time. So when you try to train them to do paranormal things, they're always getting stuck at this intuitive barrier, this barrier between the intellect and the intuition. And they have a hard time with that. So I developed this Tom's Park to help them develop their intuitive side. And I use their imagination to do that. And the way I do that is I give them an environment in which there's a lot of things happening. An environment which has not only a lot of interesting activities, but a lot of interesting people to interact with at the same time. So you have an ability to go to Tom's Park and use your imagination and get so involved with your imaginative story, because you're doing this imaginative story in all senses. You're smelling, you're tasting, you're feeling, you're seeing, you're hearing. It's a complete, total 5 senses experience. And when you get so evolved in it that you forget about what happens next just takes care of itself. The story just evolves however it evolves. So once you let that story evolve however it evolves, at that point, you're no longer making it up. It's not your imagination anymore. You've just locked into a story that is unraveling as it does. And that story is coming to you in a data stream from the larger conscious system, as does all information come to you as a data stream from the larger conscious system. That's what we are. We're consciousness, and what we see as reality is actually information. So the way Tom's Park works is it helps take your imagination, and with that imagination through practice, and you may have to practice and practice. It may take a lot of time using Tom's Park. It's not a one-shot thing like, oh, you get it, you read it, and now you're a wizard. It doesn't work like that. You have to practice and practice. And with practice, you will be able to imagine in all five senses. You will be able to let that imagination take its own, make its own story as it goes. You will find familiarity in this intuitive space, because once that story is going on its own, you're in intuitive space now. You're not in intellectual space anymore. You're in intuitive space. So it's just an easy way to slip into an intuitive space. And the more you do that, the easier it is to do it. And the more you do that, the more your intellect will practice letting go and letting you have your just knowing without any reason why, just knowing. It kind of lets that in. It lets that go as a possibility. So what it does is it takes people who have a real hard time experiencing paranormal things and gives them a pathway by which they can develop their intuitive side. Now, if they keep working on that development of their intuitive side, there's also things in Tom's Park that will help them heal themselves or heal others, will help them, go out of body, remote view, do all those things. But those are kind of for the little more advanced users, but the ones that start at the bottom are just supposed to play and have fun and interact with other people. Another thing Tom's Park does is that it provides a supportive, secure, non-threatening environment for which people have the courage to just be themselves, to be open, to be forthright, to let their walls down, let their images go, to be authentic. So they can come to Tom's Park and just be authentic, who they are, interact with other people, interact with the things to do, interact with the other people there, and learn how to be authentic, learn what their fears are, and then start working on getting rid of those fears. Because as long as you're out in this world where there's constant responsibilities, things to do, threats here, threats there, you're worried about your job, you're worried about your finances, you're worried about this and that, you're worried about relationships, you're worried about your kids, and you've got all this going on all the time. That puts you in such a mishmash of worry and concern and focus that it gets really hard to grow in that environment. So Tom's Park gives you a gentle, supportive environment that you can grow in and find your fears and get rid of them, deal with them there. There's a fear clinic there. You can go to the fear clinic and you can get help with your fears. There's things that help you travel around, have different experiences with different data streams coming from the larger conscious system. So anyway, it's just a neat experiential place where it's not that there's a story for you to read, but you are the main character in your story. And you have to use it iteratively. You say it's not a one-time shot or even a 2 or 10-time shot. It's something you have to build. You have to build your ability to use. It's a tool. You have to build your ability to use the tool properly. But if you get the tool and if you use it regularly or often, things will start to develop for you. You start seeing things that you didn't see before. You start making connections you didn't make before. You can have relationships that are more honest and open, like it's hard to have here, perhaps. So it's a learning place. It's a learning tool. And everybody will have a different experience. There's not a Tom Spark experience. Tom Spark is just a tool to help you find your own experience and open your own mind to bigger pictures. And the thing that I tell people is that all the things that happen to you in your Tom's Park adventures are just as important. That reality is a different data stream, and it's just as valuable. You learn just as much as you do in any reality. It's just a different virtual reality. It's not it's just fake because you're making it up. No, your imagination is just one source of data. The larger conscious system and other pieces of consciousness are the other sources of data. And all of those sources pose issues and challenges and questions and choices. And by the choices you make, you evolve or de-evolve the quality of your consciousness. So this gives you a kind, gentle place to make better choices. And so it does a lot of things, but those are some of the things. But it's a tool, like any tool. You know, if the first time you pick up a hammer, you're not very good at hammering nails. You know, you bend a lot of nails, you know, you knock them over, you hit the wood without hitting the nail, you know, you hit your thumb, you know, you do a lot of things like that when you first pick up a hammer. But if you are a carpenter and you've been using a hammer for years, you can drive a nail with 3 shots that takes somebody else 20. Not because you're so strong, but because you understand the tool and how to use it. And the tool becomes a part of you. And Tom Spark's like that. It's a tool. So it's a tool you have to take the time to learn, to use, but it will custom fit to suit any lesson, any particular lesson you have to learn. It will kind of custom fit itself to teach you that lesson. So
Thank you, Tom. I think this information you've given, you've clarified the difference between these double slit experiments for me. I'm thinking if I can understand that, then a general audience can. And you've given some wonderful information about Tom Spark that I think will be exciting to people, especially for this new year. I think we need something like that, an environment that is safe and will evolve our consciousness. I think that's a very wonderful thing. So thank you. Thank you.
INMBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our newly created Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.